Republicans and Democrats alike have adjusted to campaigning digitally. So far, they seem to be pretty successful in their outreach. The president's re-election campaign and the RNC announced that they have reached 17 million voters since going to all virtual.
And before the transition, the RNC and Trump campaign raised $212 million in the first fundraising quarter. Joining us now via Skype with her thoughts on why is Liz Harrington. She's the national spokesperson for the RNC. Good to see you, Liz. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Liz.
Just give us, Liz, an update on the numbers, where you stand and how those compare to Biden and the DNC.
Right. Well, so Biden and the DNC have not yet released their Q1 total, but it is probably going to be much lower than ours. For perspective, our fundraising is $270 million more cash on hand than Barack Obama had in 2012 going into his reelection campaign year. So we're in a very strong footing. You mentioned virtual campaigning. We've seamlessly, along with the Trump campaign, the RNC has gone completely digital. It took us less than 24 hours. And the enthusiasm is still there because we've already seen over 200,000 Americans signed up to volunteer and contribute online.
Mm-hmm. Liz, one thing I think everybody's really interested in terms of the mechanics of the campaigning is it's looking like these social distancing guidelines could last now for a while. What is the plan really in the meantime for when things break out in order to initiate like voter contact and all of these things? Because I know that they take so long in normal campaign cycles, almost 1 year out. So what's the plan in that restricted timeline to deal with that?
Well, what puts us in such an incredible position also is because we've really never left those battleground states, those 17 or 18 states from 2016. We've had such a solid volunteer base and grassroots support in those states and great teams that don't get flown in from DC, but they actually live in their community. And those are our campaign and political directors in those states. So going forward, we already have a great solid foundation. But in the meantime, before we get back and knocking on doors and holding rallies and doing things like we used to, we're going to continue to grow out our infrastructure online. And so we're using that through Trump Talk. It's a completely digital platform to allow our volunteers to call and make phone calls. We've already made 13 million phone calls since we went completely on digital, and our National Day of Action, it was over 1.5 million. To put that into perspective, in the 2018 midterm cycle, that took us an entire week to get over 1 million phone calls. So people are still really engaged. We know this is a difficult time for a lot of Americans. We want to point them to the information they need. We point them to the CDC, but we still talk about issues that don't go away because of this pandemic. There's still a lot of special elections. We're working really hard to keep people engaged. We're doing digital trainings. And the response has been really incredible because people still want to be involved, and there's still a lot of energy and support for the president.
Liz, how are you all thinking about lessons from 2018? It wasn't a great election year for you all. Obviously, Democrats were able to win back the House on the strength of a massive surge in turnout, especially among suburban voters. Were there lessons that were learned there that you're pushing into 2020 with?
Well, midterms and general elections are very different for a lot of reasons. However, we always take lessons learned. We always look at what the data is telling us, and we're a very data-driven campaign. We've invested over $300 million into that, and it really allows us to find voters where they are and issues that they care about. And so the biggest difference going into 2020 versus 2018 is President Trump's going to be at the top of the ticket. And that is a big gain for us. And that really drives turnout. Obviously, with the coronavirus, this is a very different campaign cycle right now. But we're working really hard as ever. We're very proud how easily we were able to transition online. The Trump campaign is getting over 1 million views for surrogates and their online video series that they do every night. It's pretty impressive to see, and we know that energy is there. So we look at the data. We're talking about issues that people care about, and that's changing, daily given this pandemic. And we're going to continue to show the contrast because the contrast is still very clear with what President Trump is doing in his leadership and versus Democrats who continue to play politics with this pandemic.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, Liz, is, with all this money, the Trump campaign, despite the fact of having almost no money, was able to still win the last time around. So what does the money actually mean in terms of trying to drive turnout and these other things when Trump was able to do so much with so little the last time?
Right. Well, you can't recreate 2016 exactly. He's now an incumbent president, but it gives us a huge opportunity to look down ballot and have all these resources to drive turnout across the country. And it's a different, in 2016, Republicans had the House. We don't have the House anymore. So that's a big priority because we see the way Nancy Pelosi has used her leadership, which is waste our time with a phony impeachment push. And now playing politics when Americans are hurting and needed those small business loans. Democrats blocked that with the Paycheck Protection Program. So there's so many issues that we show the contrast. We take our fundraising, we go back into the ground. That looks a little bit different right now because we're not knocking on doors, we're not meeting in person. But the method is still really a lot the same. We're still doing virtual trainings. They're just done virtually. We're still doing voter registration drives. We're still making voter outreach. They're just being done over the phone. And so all of that stuff is still, a lot of it hasn't really changed. It's just a little bit of the method and the outreach, doing it all online. But that buildup that we have is such an asset, especially when you look at what the Democrats have. They're in such a worse position for all their races across the country because they don't have that infrastructure built in place.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Joe Biden just won the primary without even setting foot in some of these states and spending way less money. So I'm just not sure at the presidential level, honestly, how much of a difference it makes. A massive disparity obviously would be important.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, Liz, though, to the extent that you can share this data, I mean, what is your data saying about where supporters of Bernie Sanders are likely to go in the general election?
This is a very interesting question because if you look at Bernie Sanders, his supporters, I don't think Joe Biden is really going to have much success there because it's a very different, everyone makes comparisons with 2016, but 2016, the race was had and the race was won by President Trump. And one of the big issues in that election was trade. And that was a Bernie Sanders issue as well. So President Trump really has already appealed to those voters, not just by talking about how bad NAFTA was, not just by griping about bad trade deals, but actually changing things, actually getting things done. And so President Trump, on our data that we've seen a lot of disaffected Democrats who identified with the Democratic Party for decades have already come into our side. When we were holding rallies last fall, we had huge turnout, 20 to 25%. Every rally were registered Democrats signing up to go see the president. So on that issue of trade, Bernie Sanders, I think, and the Democrats have really lost them because they've seen President Trump has delivered, and he came in and he got USMCA. He's holding China accountable. And how important do we see that bringing that core manufacturing back to the United States is? So when you're talking about Bernie supporters that are left, they are, far to the left. They are calling for no deportations, which Joe Biden is now calling for no criminal deportations in his first 100 days. They're calling for socialized medicine. Well, Joe Biden is going in that direction with a public option. They're calling for a Green New Deal and no fossil fuels. Well, Joe Biden's trying. He's saying in his conference yesterday with Bernie Sanders that I'm going to need you. I'm going to need the socialists to govern. So he's trying to appeal to those diehards, but I don't think it's going to work. But he's ruining his platform in the process by going so far to the left and turning off middle of the road voters who don't want America to be a socialist country.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure, Liz. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Next on Rising, Chicago poll worker has died of coronavirus, and now the election board is sending letters to poll workers and voters. We're going to be talking about this tragic turn with The Intercept's D.C. bureau chief Ryan Grimm when Rising continues.